Okay, thank you. Welcome here, ladies and gentlemen, and you're most welcome on my behalf as well. And just to say that this conversation is organized by Humania päihdepolitiikkaa. My handwriting is terrible. Can't even read it. And welcome also Daniel Joloy. You are a senior policy advisor in law and policy program in Amnesty International in their headquarters in London. And I'm Janne Hopsu, journalist at MTV3 News. War on drugs is not a novelty. It's been among us already for decades. As a term and especially as a policy, war on drugs was coined and made popular in the early 70s by the US President Richard Nixon. And the official US policy still aims to wipe out production and consumption of drugs, from cannabis and cocaine to synthetic substances. And just one example of this official US war on drugs is or was Plan Colombia, on which United States poured lots of dollars. It was executed between 1999 and 2015, and its main emphasis was on military aid, and there still are some US troops in Colombia. But as we know, the results of this Plan Colombia they were meager, but the consequences are big on human lives and with gross human rights violations. And it's needless to say that the coca is still planted in Colombia, cocaine is still produced and exported in huge quantities all around the world, to Europe as well. But during the last 2 years, the name which is most associated with drugs is not Colombia, but it's Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte, whose approach to this issue, drugs, is to shoot to kill. And usually those who are killed on the streets are either innocent or they are poor drug users, not the big fish who are running the whole show. So Daniel, let's start with the Philippines. Is this Duterte's gangsterism? Is it a sign and a symptom of the times?
Well, I think the Philippines has taken the idea of the war on drugs to an extreme. That is clear. Where, as you were saying, the police have killed and paid others to kill alleged drug users, mostly coming from poor and marginalized communities. We have seen in the last year and a half, a wave of deliberate killings and widespread extrajudicial executions that, as Amnesty found in a report we produced last year, may amount to crimes against humanity. Since June 2016, when this war on drugs began in the Philippines, there have been at least 12,000 people who have been killed. The majority of the victims, as you were saying, are poor or from marginalized communities. Even children have been killed and accused for selling drugs, children as young as 10 years old. And all these under false allegations that they are selling drugs. And all these killings, as I was saying, more than 12,000 people that have been killed are in complete impunity. To date, we have seen no credible investigations. And even more, the police have tried to cover up for these. Too often they are planting weapons or drugs just to say that the victims were involved in organized crime. And even though if they would be involved in organized crime, extrajudicial executions are clearly against international human rights law. They should be prosecuted in fair trials if they committed a crime. And not only they are covering up for these, the authorities are completely refusing to investigate these crimes. And they have actually also denied access to UN human rights experts to conduct independent investigations. President Duterte has even threatened the International Criminal Court prosecutor, who said they are opening an investigation into the Philippines and what may constitute crimes against humanity. But let me just say that also the Philippines is not alone in this, and many other countries have taken these extreme policies in order to control drugs. Countries like Mexico and Brazil have deployed the armed forces in their effort to fight organized crime or to control drug trafficking. In Mexico, for example, we have seen more than 200,000 people killed since the war on drugs began in 2006. Today, more than 30,000 people remain disappeared in what they say they are linked to organized crime. And many other countries like Indonesia, Iran, or China continue to apply the death penalty for drug-related offenses, which is clearly, again, against international human rights law. So what we can see, what it is clear, is that the war on drugs is actually a war on people, in which states have actually decided to punish, stigmatize, and demonize people in order to deter others from using drugs. People who use drugs, as I was saying, are often stigmatized and scapegoated for many other problems. They are always thought to be criminals, sick people, or immoral, and simply for their use of drugs. Like, authorities are eager to justify human rights violations simply because they decided to use a substance. And all this in the name of protecting health, which is too often ignored by those who advocate the war on drugs. They often ignore that it is actually prohibition that has created more harms than drugs themselves.
It's a bit like with alcohol in Finland or in the US in the last century. The prohibition doesn't help.
Exactly.
And then the policy has been run by the US and quite many countries for decades, and the results are bad.
And we have seen those results. We have seen actually more harms than goods, right? Like, we have seen people who are deterred from seeking help because they are afraid from being prosecuted. They do not want to go to the doctor if they need treatment or rehabilitation because they are afraid they are going to be sent to jail. Or we are seeing drugs that are more dangerous, or that people who want to buy those drugs and go to the illicit market, they don't know what they are buying. So they are buying adulterated drugs that are creating more harms to them. Or they are sharing needles, for example, that it's driving the rates of HIV and hepatitis C. So the harms of prohibition are actually greater than we can have by different policies that try to reduce harms.
So I mentioned earlier Plan Colombia, where the U.S. government, Colombian governments, they run the plan 16 years, and they really didn't that much were concerned with the international law and human rights. So these kind of U.S.-supported or some other big nation-supported plans against drugs, their production and use just doesn't help.
Yeah, I mean, I think Plan Colombia, as you were saying, is one of the clearest examples of the militarized approach on the war on drugs. And what have been the consequences of it? It's very clear that more violence, suffering, abuse, and disease, it's actually the legacy of all these 50 years of prohibition. And this has only not been in Colombia, but also in the neighboring countries and in Latin America in general. In Colombia in particular, we have seen how indigenous peoples have been targeted and particularly affected because of Plan Colombia. Thousands and thousands of indigenous peoples have been displaced from their lands because of the violence that the Plan Colombia and the militarization of public security has taken, and many others because of the campaigns to forcibly eradicate crops. So we have seen in Colombia how these campaigns from aerial spraying, mostly carried out on indigenous lands, which is actually one of the requirements of the UN drug conventions to eradicate these crops. But what is their impact? And we have seen that these indigenous lands, like this aerial spraying is carried out without the free and informed consent of these indigenous peoples, and that it's actually contaminating their lands, affecting their right to food, to water, their right to health. Like, children are being born with diseases because of the chemicals that they are spraying over their lands. And despite all these violations, as you were saying, the production and distribution of drugs, of coke and coca plants and cocaine has not stopped. Just like the recent figures from UNODC has shown that it's actually increasing. And even in those years, in the previous decade, that there was seen some decrease in the production, there were automatic increases in the neighboring countries. So when Colombia was decreasing, Peru was increasing. So we were just displacing the problems to the neighboring countries.
It's like squeezing an air balloon.
Exactly.
That's it. Yeah, yeah.
Which the UNODC said there were like the unintended consequences
Yes.
of the war on drugs.
In Colombia, it's mostly in countryside. In Mexico, it's apocalyptic, all-out war on drugs between drug cartels and officials. Sometimes there's corruption and collusion as well. But how about in Brazil?
Well, Brazil is definitely another example of the brutal results of the war on drugs and the militarized example. It is very clear in Brazil as well how the military strategy has had disproportionate effect on the poorest and the most marginalized communities. An investigation carried out by Amnesty International a couple of years ago on killings by the police in Rio de Janeiro showed that actually the majority of the victims were young black men, mostly from the favelas. Normally, again, similar as in the Philippines. After the police killed these young men, they were trying to cover up for their crimes. They were planting weapons or drugs to victimize the victims, to re-victimize them. And then they were not conducting any investigations. They even said that after they killed Eduardo de Jesus, a 10-year-old boy who was playing with his cell phone on the doorstep of his house, they said that he was carrying a gun and represented a threat to the police. And despite all these cases and all these tragic deaths, far from changing the highly militarized strategy in Brazil and this approach, the authorities seem resolved to increase this war. Just in February, a few months ago, the Brazilian president authorized the military to take all public security responsibilities in Rio de Janeiro. And just 1 month after this decision, one of the bravest human rights defenders and one of the most critical voices against police abuses was killed when she was going to her home. Marielle Franco, one of the most outspoken voices in Brazil, was assassinated in the car. Today, more than 3 months after, we do not know who killed her and who ordered this killing. And it sent a very chilling message to all human rights defenders who are raising their voices against these injustices. And this is very common in all countries. These attacks against human rights defenders who raise their voices against injustice, who criticize the war on drugs, are often being threatened and attacked simply because of doing their human rights work. It's human rights defenders who are at the front lines, who are facing all the brunt and together with the poor and marginalized communities who are being killed and attacked simply because of their human rights work.
So we know it's the fact that the use of psychoactive drugs, the use of it's not going to end. It's a bit like alcohol. How to finish this culture of impunity and this respect of human rights? I mean, all the Dutertes of the world, they simply just don't care. But what is your view as a scholar and Amnesty worker?
I mean, I think it's clear that drugs have been with humanity for the whole history, and like we have prohibited drugs for 50 years, and it's clear what the legacy is. It's a legacy of violence, abuse, suffering, and disease. It's clear that we need to change course. We cannot continue this way, and human rights can actually be a new, different way to deal with the risks and harms associated with drugs. We need to prioritize public health and human rights when dealing with drug control. And that is something that, from Amnesty, we want to promote more. And we want to insist and encourage states to put the health and human rights of the people at the center of every national and international drug policy. Human rights cannot continue to be the collateral damage of the war on drugs. I think next year opens a very important window of opportunity to change course. I don't know if you know, but the next year, in 2019, all countries will gather in the UN again to discuss or to review the political declaration and plan of action on drugs. And this is a plan of action that was first designed in 2009 for over a decade, and the slogan there was a world-free drug. I think 10 years after, it's clear that we have failed. It's clear that we need a new way to define and design our drug control policies. So we're encouraging and we're urging states to take a new path and to put human rights at the center.
What we can expect of this UN meeting next year? I mean, the UN is quite conservative in this. And is the UN still supporting policies of those governments who are implementing death penalties, for example?
I mean, I'm not sure I would say the UN is conservative. I think it moves at a very, very slow pace, and it can be very frustrating. And from an activist that goes very often to those meetings, it is probably one of the most challenging spaces to try to bring change. But I think it's very important to be there. And I think over the years, we have seen that what is called the Vienna Consensus, it's broken. And as you were saying, I mean, I think the death penalty is one of the clearest examples. And that has been actually one of the main battlegrounds. I think it's very illustrative to say that the death penalty up until today has not been mentioned in one single resolution coming from the Vienna bodies in the UN. And that is because this very small group of states that still retain the death penalty for drug-related offenses have a lot of power in Vienna. And because all the resolutions have to be taken by consensus, that is, there is no vote, so
Which states mentioned?
So today we know that there are around 30 states who still retain the death penalty, but it's only a handful of states that still apply it. Iran, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, China. Though even Russia does not apply it, but it's very outspoken on these issues. They still insist that the death penalty should not be mentioned, that is an issue of their sovereignty, and that the death penalty serves for them to control drug use and prevent deaths from the use of drugs. But last year, in 2016, when we went to this General Assembly Special Session on drugs, we saw a very big group, around 56, I think there were, mostly European and Latin American countries, that when they saw that the death penalty was not included in the final resolution, they issued a statement, a very vocal statement, saying that the death penalty needs to be abolished, at least for drug-related offenses, as a first step towards the full abolition of the death penalty. So we see some examples. And I think it's also very important to say that little triumph that we got in 2016, that for the first time, as one of the main pillars of drug control, we saw a chapter on human rights. That was the first time that we actually saw human rights as a component of drug policies. And now we are seeing, again, that small group of conservative or, the same group that retains the death penalty that want to see that chapter gone out of that. So I think we, again, need to go next year as civil society and together with those allied countries to insist and to ensure that chapter is not only retained but expanded.
Quite a lot depends on what the United States does. Now, President Trump has said that he's considering death penalty for the drug dealers, but just long before Trump, it was, like I said, President Nixon began the war on drugs pretty much on against those who were protesting the Vietnam War, and after that, U.S. was kind of pushing their strict policy on other countries as well, and the UN as well. So we know that in case that things change, things had to change in the US as well. So how do you turn heads in the United States?
I think it's true that the US has for long been the guardian of the UN drug conventions. And as you were saying, they have inflicted tremendous pressure on particularly on countries on the global south to respect and to enforce prohibition and criminalization. They have even threatened to stop their cooperation with those countries if they don't comply with these policies. But I think we should not close our eyes to see that in recent years we have also begun to see change despite the US. So we have seen countries like Portugal, Uruguay, even Bolivia, Canada, they are taking a different path away from prohibition and criminalization. And we should try to see what is happening there. And this, we even saw some change at the local level in the US. It is very unfortunate what's happening now with Trump and their encouragement of the Singapore death penalty policy and trying to, again, revamp the use of the death penalty for drug dealers in the US. But at the same time, we saw last year that Singapore reformed the use of the death penalty to abolish the mandatory death penalty for drugs. And we saw the same in Malaysia and Iran. So three of the most the top executioners for drug-related offenses have actually taken the steps the other way. So I think steps can be taken, and we should try to see those positive steps that can be taken.
So some good news in all these dark times. And there are quite many former Latin American state leaders present saying that it's the war on drugs has been a mistake. It didn't bring the results. So do you expect more of these? Do these their voices? Does it matter? They're huge leaders of the countries that produce huge amounts of drugs, from Colombia to Brazil and other countries, Mexico as well.
So a few years ago, we saw the creation of the Latin American Commission on Drugs, which was formed at the beginning by the former presidents of Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. But then, just a couple of years after, it actually evolved to the Global Commission on Drug Policy. And now we have former presidents from all over the world. We have former President of Switzerland, Ruth Dreyfus, who was the one who actually changed drug policies in Switzerland, making it a lot based on public health. We have Kofi Annan. We have Michel Kasachkin. We have many world leaders who are joining this global commission and who are very outspoken leaders, promoting a new way to see the war on drugs and to inflict or to reform drug policies to put human rights and public health at the center.
So from dehumanizing drug users to going decriminalizing and depenalizing the sale and the use of drugs, and like in the U.S., some states it's being sold in licensed stores, or in Uruguay in pharmacies. How long is that way from dehumanizing to let's say decriminalizing and depenalizing and legalizing?
I mean, let's see. I mean, we hopefully we will be moving more and more towards those steps. And I think there are many lessons that we must draw when designing these new policies. And you mentioned Uruguay and the US, but there are many other examples, as I was mentioning, Switzerland, Portugal, that are favoring public health and human rights approaches when dealing with drugs. And we also need to see not only those successful models when dealing with what we today consider as illicit drugs, but also how we are regulating what we consider legal drugs. So how are we regulating alcohol and tobacco? And there are many examples. I mean, those are drugs, and those have can have a very harmful impact on public health. But why those drugs do not have such a violent environment? So what can we learn from those? There are also many innovative harm reduction services that we are seeing all over the world. They were just telling me how Finland is now doing a lot in terms of harm reduction and providing these health services for people who decide to use drugs. So, I mean, I think there is a way to rethink our drug policies. There are alternatives, and we must begin walking that way.
So, in Finland, still, for a politician to talk about these topics on decriminalizing and depenalizing, it's more or less a political suicide. Should Finnish politicians be more brave on this topic?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say for me is, that's why I'm very happy to be here. I think the first step is to open the dialogue. Without an informed debate, we will not be able to move anywhere. And as you were saying, we must begin changing our stigmatized perception towards people who use drugs. Yesterday, I was talking to a group of people who use drugs, and a woman was telling me the stories of humiliation, abuse, and violence she had faced here in Finland simply for her use of drugs. And she told me that, I mean, I think it was very revealing that, I mean, it's obvious, but hearing it from a woman here in Finland, she was telling me that people who use drugs are still people, and their human rights must be respected. And that's clear. I'm sure no politician would dare to contradict that statement, right? So we can't continue to allow the violation of human rights simply because someone decided to use drugs. That has to change. And I mean, it's clear Finland is known for their great care for human rights, and it would be great to see Finland setting the example, both here domestically and taking a stand at the international level. As I was saying, next year is crucial, and I would be very happy to see Finland joining that group of states that are at the vanguard of criticizing prohibition and ending with this criminalization. I think change is long overdue, and we can now begin a new chapter on drug control.
Tell me a bit more about the results in Portugal when they changed their policies.
Well, the Portugal model began when people were injecting drugs on the streets, in the park, and the rates of HIV were so high. People were dying on the streets because of overdose. So they decriminalized the use and possession of all drugs. And instead of punishing people and sending them to the jail, they were offering them treatment, healthcare services, rehabilitation if they wanted. And with this, the amount of overdoses decreased tremendously, and the rates of HIV went even below the average in Europe. With years, it's been over a decade now since they began with this policy, and even the rates of use, and particularly the problematic use of drugs, has decreased. So they are showing positive public health and human rights results because of this policy.
So I would imagine the way that how Portuguese themselves as people see the drug use has changed as well. They say that the change of policy was worth it.
I mean, I think we need to definitely analyze the evidence, and we need to see what are the human rights and public health implications of policies, and compare them against the tragic results of prohibition and criminalization.
What about those countries you mentioned, Iran and Malaysia, where we have the impression that they are really harsh on these topics and human rights concerning drug use? What is the change there? You already mentioned, but is it?
I mean, I think the main change that we have seen, and the only research that from Amnesty we have carried out, it's on the reforms of the death penalty for drug-related offenses. And I think these legal reforms are very important. We are yet to see how they are going to be applied. I think the potential for saving many lives of people who are today on death row, it's very, very big, and we should keep insisting on those governments to actually continue on that path.
How do you see the argument that legalizing at least cannabis is good example that it brings tax money for the governments, and then that money can be allocated to rehabilitation, for example?
I think it's clear that over the years we have allocated so many resources to law enforcement and to policing and to enforce criminalization and prohibition. There is a campaign by this organization called Harm Reduction International, who they are saying that if we at least advocate 10% of those resources towards health and harm reduction, the results could be completely different. I think it's an issue of political will, and we are seeing more countries more invested in like toughest policies instead of actually allowing harm reduction and human rights.
Like in the US, you know, you can't be soft on certain issues, and one is you can't be soft on drugs. So that's the one way you have to change that perception and thinking.
I mean, I would question what being soft on drugs mean. I think implementing harm reduction and human rights policies is actually caring for people and implementing more humane, effective, and evidence-based policies. It's not about being soft. It's about caring for the other and promoting life and human rights.
Okay. What is Amnesty as an organization doing to put an end to these human rights violations? What is your impact on the next year's UN meeting?
Well, Amnesty, to begin with, we are a campaign-driven organization. So we go to countries where we see human rights violations, we investigate those, and then we advocate for change. And we mobilize people all over the world to call on the governments to change and to stop these human rights violations. So as I was mentioning, for example, in the last few years, we did this research in Brazil, in the Philippines, in these countries, in Singapore, in Malaysia, where the death penalty is still applied. We did also a very interesting piece of research last year in the USA, where we were documenting the criminalization of pregnant women who use drugs, who they are accused of homicide or these fetal assault laws. And because they are saying that, the government says that because they are using drugs, they are attacking or attempting to kill the fetus, and therefore they are sent to jail, which is insane. We are criminalizing the women, and instead of providing them health, even like prenatal care that it's necessary for the fetus, we are sending them to jail. So many women are deterred from actually seeking the medical services they need.
Are those people aware of services they may have?
Sometimes not. But we interviewed one woman who was so afraid of going to the doctor that she ended up giving birth on the street. She was so afraid to going to the doctor. And what is the risk to the fetus in there, or to the baby she was having? Instead of providing her harm reduction, and perhaps if the doctor would speak to her, she would be able to stop using drugs during the pregnancy. There is no way to deny that drugs may have a harmful effect on the baby. But why, instead of denying her that humane policies, we're just sending her to the margins? So that is the type of work we are doing at Amnesty. And we are also obviously participating at these UN meetings. We will be obviously at the UN for the review in 2019. We will be calling on states to ensure that human rights play a central role when defining new drug control policies.
Okay, we're running out of time. There's 2-3 minutes. If there are any questions from the audience. Yes, please.
More or less a comment. My name is Daniel Joloy. I'm a lecturer at Metropolitan here in Helsinki.
You want mic?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. Usually my students can hear me.
We have a microphone here and there and everywhere.
I'm not used to using this. That's great. I'm from the U.S. and I was there when Nixon started the war on drugs. It was a failure then. It continues to be a failure. The best way to treat drug abuse is medically. You know, it's not going to be done with jail. The United States has one of the highest people in jail in the world, and a good portion of them are people who use cannabis, who have sold cannabis. Now, I'm glad MTV is doing this this presentation, because Cannabis is in a different league, a different category. But because of politics that goes all the way back when Hearst was alive, back in the early 1900s, when cannabis and hemp was a competition to the timber industry that he had, they made it illegal. Now, there's a long history about that. But recently, within the last 10, 15 years, there's been a tremendous amount of global peer-reviewed medical studies that have been done on the treatment with cannabis for cancer, for people with neurological disease and ailments, people who have long-term severe pain. It's worked on them. I mean, all anybody has to do is do their research and you'll see. Currently here in Finland, we do have marijuana treatment, but it's done by a spray that we buy from Israel, who's doing a lot of research on it right now, and it's only dispensed in Turkey for stage 3, stage 4 cancer. Now, if we expand it to even include the plant material, we'd be able to treat everything that people that use opioids for. Currently, as you can see, I carry a cane because of back issues. Those back issues, they treat me with opioids. And as you know, in the United States, they have a tremendous problem with opioids. And there's statistics that say 150 people die a day from overdose of opioids. We could very well, look at expanding that so that people here can use it without using, these pharmaceuticals. One more line, I know. Just think, because it's a cost savings too. And as we know with this government, they've cut a lot in the social welfare state. We'd be saving a lot of money by prescribing cannabis for the ailments that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you for a comment. Do you want a short comment on that before we end?
I mean, definitely, I agree. I think the medical uses of drugs is part of the right to health, and states have an obligation to ensure that people who have certain illnesses have access to those drugs.
But there's a tendency here to group cannabis with all the hard drugs, and it's not in the same category.
Yeah.
But that's because of the prohibition, and that's because of ignorance, especially in politics.
Yeah.
Okay,
there is
yes,
something else I just wanted to say from your first comment of how many people are in prison because of these drugs. And globally, the UNODC had this figure that around 25% of all prison population globally are because of drugs, and 83% of those are only for possession of drugs. So simply people who use drugs who are being sent to jail. And another very interesting figure, particularly in Latin America, nearly 60 to 80% of all women who are incarcerated are because of possession of drugs. So who are these people who are being sent to jail? The most marginalized, the most discriminated against people. In the US, it's mostly Black Americans and Hispanic or Latinos who are being sent to jail because of drugs. So there is a hugely disproportionate impact on the most marginalized communities because of drug control.
Thank you. That's a good point to end with. Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you for the audience, and I hope you have a good day here in Maailma, kylässä. Thank you.
Thanks.